No bigger than a pinpoint and invisible to the naked eye, some are the larvae stages of various marine animals. Together with the debris of wrecked seaweed, they form a nourishing soup, the staple food of all those shrimps, clams, and worms on which the Tideline birds depend. As the tide ebbs, flock after flock of different birds arrive to take advantage of the exposed feeding grounds. There's room for everyone, and they hardly ever interfere with each other because each species feeds in its own way, its bill adapted to a certain method of feeding. But one bird's adaptation is truly unique: the oyster catchers. Found in many parts of the world, the oyster catcher is a common, highly successful, and long-lived bird. Its lifespan is about 20 years. Probing the tide line for food, it can't see what it's doing most of the time. But it doesn't need to. The tip of its long, sturdy bill is a mass of sensitive nerve endings that enable the oyster catcher to explore the invisible world beneath the rocks and shallows for snails and worms. It will even go to inland fields to look for earthworms and insect larvae. But mainly, the oyster catcher uses its bill for something besides digging. Although they seldom catch oysters, as their name would have us believe, they are astonishingly skilled at catching and opening other shellfish, primarily mussels. Mussels live in large beds, parts of which are exposed or lie in shallow water at low tide. Oyster catchers are a special study of Nico Tinbergen, professor of animal behavior at Oxford University. Considering how difficult it is for a man to open a mussel, it's hard to imagine that any bird could do it. We can't pull the shells apart when they're tightly shut. It takes a knife blade to pry them open, first cutting the powerful adductor chain which clamps the shells together. This is the adductor which has been severed. But even though the mussel is open, the flesh has still got to be cut out. This is the succulent mouthful that rewards any creature able to pry open the shells. And the only bird skillful enough to do it is the oyster catcher. With astonishing speed, it opens a mussel and cuts out the flesh, a fantastic example of animal skill. It has to work fast, for there's only an hour or two at low tide when the shellfish can be found. Using its only tool, its bill, the oyster catcher opens mussels in two different ways. To show just how extraordinary these methods are, Dr. Tinbergen demonstrates both. First of all, having obtained a closed mussel, the bird turns it over with flat side uppermost, exposing what is usually the weakest part of the shell, just here. Using a pair of scissors as the bird's bill, Dr. Tinbergen shows how it hammers at this spot until it makes a hole. Then the bill goes through this hole and slices the adductor muscle that holds the shells so tightly shut. Next, the shells are loosened by this quick sideways levering movement of the bill. By opening the bill like the scissors, the shells are pried apart. Now the mussel is helpless. But before the oyster catcher can get anything to eat, it has to cut out the flesh. And it does this by using the tip of the bill as a chisel. A man does it slowly and clumsily. His finest scissors are no match for the oyster catcher's bill, which can do it at triple the speed. Hammering away with tremendous vigor, an oyster catcher can open and clean out a mussel in well under 30 seconds. Strangely enough, they always seem to know the exact place on the shell to hammer. And oyster catchers that hunt like this are called hammerers. It would be hard for a hammerer to cover up its traces. Damaged shells are a dead giveaway. The second and more usual way of getting into a mussel is to stab it when it has its shells slightly open, like this. Underwater, mussels lie with their shells slightly apart, pumping in microscopic food. With a pair of scissors, Dr. Tinbergen demonstrates how some oyster catchers take advantage of this opening. The stabbers hunt specifically for these open mussels. Like the scissors, the bill is thrust through the gap in the shells to cut the adductor. Then the mussel is wrenched off the bed, picked up in the bill, and carried away. Here's a stabber in action, carrying its mussel ashore to lever it open and chisel out the flesh. With some very speedy and skillful bill movements, it soon gets its reward. Some birds don't need to take the mussel ashore. They're expert enough to do the whole job underwater. Even among oyster catchers, there are varying degrees of expertise. This one does the job entirely by touch. Another shellfish, the cockle, also forms a large part of the oyster catcher's diet. And this, too, is a hard shell to crack. We use a knife blade or steam them open to get at the morsel of flesh inside. But the oyster catcher has only its bill to pry the shells apart and cut out the flesh. Searching for a cockle in wet sand, this oyster catcher quickly finds one and opens it as masterfully as a surgeon. Its technique is sure, flawless. It has to be. For on this skill, the bird's survival depends. How do oyster catchers develop their astonishing skills so unique among birds? Oyster catchers mate when they're 4 years old and return year after year to the same nest sites. They lay their eggs on the ground in fields and sand dunes, and sometimes right out on the open shore just above high water mark. Camouflaged among stones, the eggs are difficult to see. That's an advantage, for there's always a sharp-eyed predator, like a crow, searching for food. But the camouflage doesn't always work. As each chick hatches, the mother promptly gets rid of the empty shell, for its white inside is too easy a mark for predators. The best protection is for the mother to stay on the nest. Under her wings, the chick and eggs are safe from crows, and cold, and rain. Watchful parents, oyster catchers remain alert to danger as they oversee their chicks' development. Its first walk is something of an adventure. But soon the chick is wandering about, exploring the nest site and pecking at all sorts of odd things. Shells, stones, pieces of straw, anything it comes across. Already pecking is instinctive. but it's entirely random. At this stage, the chick doesn't know what food is. Both parents share the feeding duties. Sometimes the chick rejects food offered by one and accepts it from the other. Unusual among wading birds, the young oyster catcher not only has to learn how to feed, but even how to be fed. Following its parent, the chick soon develops an interest in the small tideline creatures that make up an oyster catcher's diet. Before long, it stands by, waiting to be fed. Very soon, a chick begins to imitate its parents, probing the ground as it will later on when it can forage alone. But for now, these movements are quite ineffectual. An empty shell may be its first experience with mussels. But as the parent brings in more from the mussel beds, the chick watches, paying attention to the quick movements of the bill as the adult bird opens the shellfish and chisels out the food. The chick's a long way from being able to deal with a mussel by itself, but by observing its parent, it will learn the technique. Like most other young animals, the chicks become drowsy after a meal and fall asleep, wherever they happen to be. Now the parents can get some rest, but not for long. Soon the chicks are awake again and, naturally, hungry. They beg with this curious pestering action, tripping up the parent and rushing round and round until at last it flies off to the feeding grounds where each pair has its own territory. Getting room on the mussel beds is a matter of chasing other birds off. There's nothing vicious about it. Usually it's all sorted out by this strange display known as piping. This ritual enables a resident territory owner to feed in peace. To be able to do so is essential. The mussel beds are exposed for only an hour or two, and there are hungry mouths waiting at the nest site. Once the chicks are fed, there's no time to waste. It's off to the feeding grounds again. On the east coast of England, a favorite nesting site of oyster catchers, Dr. Tinbergen and his wife, who acts as his research assistant, have observed and studied this unique species for many years. In order to learn how oyster catchers develop their skill, Mrs. Tinbergen has set up an experiment that will enable her to follow the chick's development from the moment it hatches through its first few weeks of life. First, she places eggs collected from nests on the beach in an incubator. As the chicks hatch, she keeps them warm in a cardboard carton until she has enough for 2 groups. The tabletop is their training ground, and Mrs. Tinbergen, not the parent bird, has to open hundreds of mussels. At this stage, the chicks, although curious, don't recognize mussels as food. The goal of her experiment is to learn how this recognition and the skill to chisel out the meat comes about. One group of chicks will be given the muscle flesh lying loosely in a shell. The chicks don't even have to work to get at the meat. A second group will receive opened muscles in which the meat is still attached to the shell. This time the chick pulls and pulls, but its efforts are useless, for it hasn't learned to use its beak. As a result of her experiment, Mrs. Tenbergen found that merely offering a chick food in a shell is not sufficient for teaching it to recognize that mussels contain a tasty morsel. Only the second group, that had to pull at the meat for themselves, learned that mussel shells are food containers. Although most oyster catchers specialize in cockles and mussels, some concentrate on crabs, and their nest sites are strewn with the remains. This young oyster catcher pecks at a crab, but its movements are random. It doesn't yet recognize a crab as food. The parent has to break it up, pick out the edible parts, and present them to the chick. Although the chick has shown signs of crude hammering, chiseling, and prying, it's still incapable of breaking up a crab. All this has to be done by the parent. Each feeding becomes a training session, one of many in the young bird's period of development. Very soon, the parents take the chicks away from the nest and out to the open shore, to the sandbanks and mussel beds and along the Tideline. Here they will stay until the chicks have grown up. Although the young oyster catchers have begun to do a little feeding for themselves, they still depend almost entirely on their parents. Now hanging back at what one might almost think a respectful distance, they tag along, never running ahead or interfering with the parents' hunting. But they're ever watchful. They have learned now what food is and what to expect. As soon as a food item is produced, they rush in at once and devour it. By now, the young oyster catcher has become black and white like its parents, but its pale legs and dark bill tip indicate that it's only 3 months old. Although almost fully grown, the young bird is still unable to find all its food by itself. It follows its parent and waits for food, just as it did when it was a chick. Having found a mussel, this young bird knows by now that the hard stone-like object contains food. But it doesn't know how to open the shell and get out the meat. Pushing and prodding don't work. Neither does picking it up and shaking it. No matter how hard it tries, the young bird doesn't get anywhere. Yet. It still has to rely entirely on the parent. Having learned to recognize a mussel, the young bird must now learn how to open it. Even though it will be several years before it can open a mussel fast enough to rear a family. Small wonder the oyster catcher doesn't mate until it's 4 years old. Gradually, day after day, as the parent bird opens mussel after mussel, the young bird becomes more skilled at chiseling out the flesh. Whether it becomes a hammerer or a stabber depends on its parents, because these techniques are learned. One day, if it becomes a stabber, it will mate with a stabber, like each of its parents. If, like its parents, a young bird becomes a hammerer, then it will mate with another of its own kind. Finally, the day comes when a young oyster catcher is able to open mussels by itself. This one-year-old bird is painfully slow compared with its parents, but at least it's able to get the mussel open and chisel out the meat. When the tide rises, it will join the other oyster catchers, whose numbers illustrate their success. There it will preen and bathe and doze until the ebb tide lets it go back to practice the skill that has taken so long to acquire. A skill that will be improved before the bird can mate and raise a family. When that day comes, a young oyster catcher will be an expert in its own right. A skilled craftsman, a specialist.